On the morning of June 28, 1984, the body of 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was discovered in her apartment in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her throat slashed with such force that she was nearly decapitated. Her apartment had been ransacked. A window screen had been cut from the outside. Neighbors heard nothing. The police had nothing, and in the weeks that followed, the Los Angeles Police Department quietly logged the murder as a brutal, isolated crime and moved on. It was not isolated. It was the opening act of the most terrifying killing campaign the city of Los Angeles had ever experienced, carried out by a man who was not just a murderer but a figure of deliberate, performative evil, a man who wanted to be feared, who fed on the fear, who walked into police headquarters after his capture and told reporters, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." Lucifer dwells within us all. His name was Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez. The press would call him the Night Stalker. And for 14 months, between 1984 and 1985, he turned the act of sleeping in your own home, the most basic human act of safety and rest, into something the people of Southern California were genuinely afraid to do. To understand what Richard Ramirez became, you have to understand what Richard Ramirez was made of, because in his case, the making of a killer is not a simple story of poverty or neglect, though those elements were present. It is a story of a specific, toxic alchemy between a damaged psychology, a formative relationship with violence, and a deliberate choice to embrace evil as an identity rather than fight it. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a Mexican-American family. His father, Julian, was a former police officer in Juarez, who had moved his family across the border and worked brutal, exhausting shifts as a laborer. Julian was not a cruel man in any premeditated way, but he was a volatile one, prone to fierce rages, to headaches so debilitating he would beat his own head against walls, to episodes that terrified his children and kept the household in a permanent state of low-level dread. Richard grew up navigating that dread. He grew up learning to read a room, to sense danger, to stay quiet and invisible when the atmosphere in the house turned dangerous. These are, in retrospect, skills that would serve a predator well. But the relationship that truly formed Richard Ramirez was not with his father. It was with his cousin Miguel, known as Mike, a Green Beret veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and returned deeply, catastrophically damaged. Mike was 17 years older than Richard. He was charismatic in the particular, seductive way of men who have seen things they cannot unsee and have chosen to make their violence a point of pride rather than a wound. He carried photographs from Vietnam, not photographs of landscapes or fellow soldiers, photographs of women he had raped and murdered during his deployment. He showed these photographs to his young cousin, with what witnesses later described as a kind of pride. He talked about violence the way other men talk about adventure. He told Richard that power was the only thing that mattered, and that the only real power was the power to take. Richard was 11 years old when he first saw those photographs. He was 12 when he began spending nights sleeping in the local cemetery because he found it peaceful. He was 13 when Mike shot and killed his own wife in front of Richard during a domestic dispute. Richard watched. He did not run. Investigators who later studied his development noted that this moment, witnessing a murder at close range at the age of 13, being exposed to no trauma-informed support or intervention afterward, and being left to metabolize it alone, may have been the moment at which Richard Ramirez's relationship to death permanently altered. He dropped out of school. He used marijuana and LSD, and later cocaine. He drifted to Los Angeles in the late 1970s, surviving through petty theft and burglary, living in cheap motels in Skid Row, eating fast food, spending hours alone in his room listening to AC/DC, and developing an interest in Satanism that was initially performative and gradually became something he treated as a genuine spiritual framework. He was skeletal, with an angular face and teeth badly damaged by years of poor nutrition and drug use. People who encountered him in those years later described him as someone who felt wrong, not threatening in an obvious, confrontational way, but carrying an atmosphere of something they could not quite name. Several people said, in retrospect, that being near him made them want to leave the room. His first confirmed murder, Jenny Vincow, went unsolved through the remainder of 1984. Then, in March of 1985, something accelerated. The gaps between attacks, which had been months, collapsed to weeks, and then to days. On March 17, 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her garage in Rosemead, shooting her in the face at close range. She survived, because the bullet deflected off her car keys. He then entered the home and shot her roommate, Dale Okazaki, at point-blank range in the forehead. Okazaki died. Ramirez left the house, got in his car, and within the hour, attacked and killed 30-year-old Tsai Lian Yu in the Monterey Park neighborhood, pulling her from her car, shooting her twice, and leaving her in the street. 2 attacks in one night, in different parts of the city. The LAPD had a serious problem, and they knew it. What followed over the next 5 months is one of the most relentless, terrifying campaigns of violence in California criminal history. Ramirez attacked in Whittier, in Monrovia, in Burbank, in Arcadia, in Monterey Park again, in the San Fernando Valley, in San Francisco. He killed men and women. He killed people in their 80s and children as young as 6. He sexually assaulted some of his victims. He ransacked homes, stealing cash and jewelry that he later traded for cocaine and bus tickets. He left satanic pentagrams drawn in lipstick on bedroom walls. He told surviving victims to swear their love to Satan. He was theatrical in his horror, not because the theater was incidental to the killing, but because the theater was part of the point. Richard Ramirez wanted to be felt. He wanted the city to know that something was out there in the dark, moving through windows, standing over beds. The public terror was unprecedented. Hardware stores across Los Angeles reported selling out of deadbolts and window locks within days of each new attack. Gun shops reported lines out the door. People who had never considered owning a weapon bought weapons. Neighborhoods that had never organized watch patrols did so. People slept with their windows nailed shut through the brutal Southern California summer heat rather than leave them open. The Night Stalker had done something that even the most experienced criminologists found remarkable. He had made an entire major American city afraid to be in their own homes. The investigation was maddening in its early stages. Ramirez had no fixed address, no consistent pattern of geography, no obvious connection to his victims. He attacked different types of people in different types of homes in different neighborhoods, apparently selecting targets opportunistically: a lit window, an unlocked gate, a house set back from the road. The LAPD and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were not, in the early months, effectively sharing information with each other or with law enforcement in the Bay Area, where Ramirez also struck. Task forces were eventually assembled, but suffered from the interagency tensions that plague major investigations. What eventually identified him was a partial shoe print and a single fingerprint. In July of 1985, investigators recovered a partial fingerprint from a stolen Toyota that Ramirez had abandoned after an attack in San Francisco. The print was run through California's relatively new automated fingerprint identification system technology that had only been operational for a short period and that the LAPD had only recently adopted. The system matched the print to Richard Ramirez, a known petty criminal with prior arrests for auto theft. Police released his photograph to the press on August 30th, 1985. The next 24 hours were extraordinary. Ramirez, who had been in Arizona visiting an acquaintance, returned to Los Angeles by bus on August 31st, unaware that his face was on every television and front page in the state. He stepped off the bus at the Greyhound terminal in downtown Los Angeles and walked into a convenience store, where a woman behind the counter recognized him, screamed, and ran. He ran too, into the East Los Angeles neighborhood of Huron Avenue, where the residents, working class, tight-knit, furious, had been living in fear of him for months. What happened next was a community doing something the police had not yet managed. Neighbors recognized Ramirez as he ran through their streets. A man named Faustino Piñon caught him trying to steal his wife's car and physically wrestled him to the ground. Other neighbors joined in. They beat him. They held him down. When a police officer arrived, he reportedly had to fight the crowd off Ramirez to keep him alive long enough to be arrested. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker who had terrorized millions of people, was brought down by residents in a neighborhood he had wandered into with their bare hands. The trial was one of the longest and most expensive in California history at that point. It lasted over 4 years, from arrest to verdict, delayed by Ramirez's behavior, by juror misconduct, by the sheer volume of evidence. Throughout the trial, Ramirez performed. He displayed a pentagram carved into his palm. He made satanic gestures at the gallery. He arrived in court with his hair styled and wearing dark sunglasses, the rock star of the courtroom, the villain who had decided that infamy was the closest he would ever get to fame. Women wrote him letters. Women sent him photographs. One woman, a groupie who had attended virtually every day of the trial, eventually married him in a jailhouse ceremony in 1996. He received more fan mail than almost any other death row inmate in California history. He gave interviews in which he was articulate, charming, and completely unrepentant. He was convicted on 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death 19 times. He sat on death row at San Quentin for over 2 decades. The psychological portrait that emerged from the trial and from subsequent forensic analysis is one of a man who had constructed a fully functional identity around the concept of evil, not as a disorder or a compulsion he was trying to resist, but as a choice he had made and was proud of. Forensic psychiatrists who examined him noted a pattern of what they called malignant narcissism, combined with antisocial personality disorder, and a grandiosity that was, in their assessment, genuine rather than performed. He believed himself to be special. He believed his violence was a form of power that most people lacked the courage to claim. He believed the victims were simply less powerful than he was, and that the strong taking from the weak was the natural order of things, a belief he had absorbed from his cousin Mike and refined over years of ideological and spiritual isolation into something that felt to him like a complete and coherent worldview. What this analysis makes clear is that Ramirez was not, in the clinical sense, psychotic. He was not hearing voices or operating under a delusion that distorted his reality. He knew what he was doing. He chose it. He planned it. He took a bus across multiple cities to commit murders and then took a bus home. He was, in the assessment of every mental health professional who examined him, fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions. The evil was not a disease. It was a decision, made and remade every time he cut a window screen and climbed inside. Richard Ramirez died in prison on June 7, 2013, of complications from B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old. He had been on death row for 23 years and was still awaiting execution when he died of natural causes, a fact that remains a source of raw, unprocessed anger for the families of his victims, many of whom had waited those same 23 years for a closure that never came in the form they needed. The city of Los Angeles processed his death in near silence. There was no public ceremony, no statement from the mayor, no moment of formal acknowledgement. Just a line in a press release from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, a brief flurry of news coverage, and then the ordinary noise of the city resuming. The Night Stalker was gone. The deadbolts and the window locks and the particular quality of fear that had gripped an entire metropolitan area in the summer of 1985 lingered in the memory of a generation of Angelenos who had never really shaken it. The 14 people he killed, Jenny Vincao, Maria Dozois, Dale Okazaki, Tsai Leon Yu, Vincent and Maxine Zazzara, William and Lily Doi, Mabel Bell, Patty Elaine Higgins, Mary Louise Cannon, Joyce Lucille Nelson, Maxine and Leela Knighting, Chaina Rong Kovananth, and Elias Abawath were not symbols. They were people who went to bed in their own homes and did not wake up. They deserve to be remembered in full. There is something uniquely disturbing about a serial killer who is, by measurable standard, one of the most intelligent people in any room he enters. Serial killers are often described in popular culture as cunning, but cunning and intelligent are not the same thing. Cunning is animal. Intelligence is architectural. Ed Kemper was intelligent in the architectural sense. He understood systems. He understood people. He understood the gap between what the world appeared to be and what it actually was. And he exploited that gap with a precision that still makes the investigators and psychiatrists who studied him speak about him in a different register than they use for other killers. Not with awe, with something closer to the profound unease of recognizing that a particular type of mind can produce a particular type of monster that the rest of us are almost constitutionally unprepared to identify. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. He was the middle child of 3, and from very early in his life, he was conspicuously different from the children around him, not in a way that was necessarily alarming at first, but in a way that those who knew him would later describe as the difference between a child who is present in a room and a child who is studying the room. He was physically enormous from a young age, eventually reaching 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds as an adult. And his size, combined with his intelligence, created a social experience that was isolating in its peculiarity. He was too large to be ignored. too smart to be simple, and too strange to be absorbed into the ordinary rhythms of childhood. His parents' marriage was a catastrophe, conducted in slow motion. His father, Edmund Jr., was a World War II veteran who seems to have done his best by the family, but whose best was not adequate to the demands of his wife, Clarnell. Clarnell Kemper is one of the most studied figures in the peripheral literature of this case, because her relationship with her son is central to understanding what he became. She was intelligent, bitter, frustrated, and cruel toward Ed in a way that was specific and targeted. She told him he was ugly. She told him no woman would ever love him. She told him he was stupid despite the evidence of his IQ, which was later measured at 145. She made him sleep in the basement because she claimed his size frightened his younger sister. She presented to the world as a competent, professional woman. She worked in university administration. While at home, she deployed her intelligence as a weapon against the child she seemed to have decided was the repository of everything she resented about her life. Ed Kemper began showing signs of profound psychological disturbance in childhood. He decapitated his sister's dolls. He buried the family cat alive, then dug it up and mounted its head on a spike. He performed what he called death games with his sister, instructing her to tie him to a chair and pull an imaginary lever while he convulsed and pretended to die in a gas chamber. He was 10 years old. His sister thought it was a game. Ed later said that he was rehearsing something, though he could not at that age have fully articulated what. When Ed was 15, his mother sent him to live with his paternal grandparents on a ranch in North Fork, California, because she found him unmanageable and, she later admitted, frightening. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a writer of Western fiction. His grandmother, Maud, was a stern and controlling woman who bore some resemblance to Clarnell in her relationship to authority. Ed worked on the ranch. He attended the local school. He was miserable. On August 27, 1963, 15-year-old Ed Kemper shot his grandmother Maud in the head with a .22 rifle while she was sitting at the kitchen table. He said later that he did it because he wanted to see what it felt like. When his grandfather returned from an errand, Ed shot him in the driveway, then called his mother to tell her what he had done. He waited calmly for the police. He was committed to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane in California. He was 15 years old, and he had just committed a double murder, and he was sent to a psychiatric institution rather than a juvenile prison, a decision that reflects both the clinical uncertainty around how to handle a case of such aberrant youth violence, and the belief held by some in the institution that Edmund Kemper was not only treatable, but genuinely promising. He was cooperative, he was articulate, he was eager to understand himself, or appeared to be. He worked as a psychiatric technician within the hospital, conducting psychological tests on other patients, and demonstrating a grasp of psychiatric methodology that impressed the staff. The institution's psychiatrists came to regard him as a model patient, a young man who had committed an appalling act in a moment of adolescent crisis, and who was clearly on a path toward genuine rehabilitation. They recommended his release to the California Youth Authority in 1969. Kemper was 20 years old. He had spent 5 years in a psychiatric institution, had studied the psychological and behavioral frameworks used to assess him, and had learned, with extraordinary precision, exactly what to say and how to say it to appear recovered. The Youth Authority released him. In what would later be described as one of the most catastrophic institutional decisions in California criminal history, they then released him into the custody of his mother, Clarnell, who had moved to Santa Cruz and was working at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The psychiatrists at Atascadero had specifically recommended against placing Ed with his mother. That recommendation was ignored. Ed Kemper moved in with Clarnell. The dynamic between them resumed immediately. Her contempt, his controlled rage, the locked basement of his psychology slowly filling with something he had spent 5 years thinking about in enormous clinical detail. He tried to live a normal life. He applied to be a California state trooper and was rejected because of his criminal record and his size. He worked construction. He bought a motorcycle. He frequented bars in Santa Cruz and the surrounding area, developing a reputation as a large, friendly, garrulous man who liked to talk to cops. He regularly drank at a bar called the Jury Room that was popular with members of the local police and sheriff's departments, and he cultivated these relationships with the same methodical intelligence he applied to everything else. And he drove. He drove the highways around Santa Cruz and along the California coast, and he picked up hitchhikers, and for the first year or so he released them. He later described this period as a rehearsal. He was testing himself, testing his control, learning the mechanics of what he was planning without yet committing to it. He was, in his own words, working up to it. On May 7, 1973, Ed Kemper picked up 2 college students hitchhiking near Berkeley, 18-year-old Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, and drove them into the remote hills of Alameda County. He had a knife and a gun in the car. He killed them both, then drove their bodies back to his apartment in Alameda, dismembered them, and disposed of the remains in various locations around the Santa Cruz Mountains. He later described this first double murder with a clinical detachment that made the investigators who heard his confession decades later visibly uncomfortable, not because it was emotionless, but because it was analytic. He talked about it the way a carpenter might talk about a difficult joint, noting what had worked, what had not, what he would do differently. He killed 6 young women over the next year. All of them were students or young women hitchhiking in the Santa Cruz area, a practice that was enormously common at that time and in that place. Santa Cruz, in the early 1970s, was a counterculture hub, and hitchhiking was a routine mode of transport for the university students who populated the area. Kemper exploited this with devastating efficiency, driving a route that passed near campus, picking up young women, engaging them in pleasant conversation with the warmth and approachability he had cultivated in those years of rehearsal, and then killing them in the car or at a remote location. His victims were Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, Alice Liu, and 2 more, whose families will never fully recover from the knowledge of what their daughters experienced in those last hours. The Santa Cruz area during this period was experiencing a convergence of serial killing that would later make it the focus of criminological study for decades. Herbert Mullen was also killing in Santa Cruz at the same time as Kemper. John Linley Frazier had committed the Ota family murders nearby 2 years earlier. Santa Cruz became known, in morbid circles, as the murder capital of the world. The Santa Cruz Police Department was under enormous pressure. The cases were not initially connected to Kemper because Kemper was connected to the police socially. He drank with them, he conversed with them about the murders they were investigating, and the psychology of that relationship is one of the most thoroughly examined elements of the case. He later told investigators that he had told a deputy sheriff, almost directly, what he was doing during a conversation at the jury room, and the deputy had laughed, assuming he was joking. On April 20th, 1973, Ed Kemper came home. His mother was asleep. He had spent 9 months killing other people's daughters, and on this night, in the small hours of the morning, he killed his own mother. He beat her to death with a hammer, cut off her head, and in an act of rage so specific and so revealing that it requires no further psychological interpretation, used it as a dartboard. He then called his mother's best friend, Sarah Hallett, invited her to come over as a surprise for Clarnell, and killed her when she arrived. He put both bodies in closets. Then, he drove east. He drove through Nevada, through Colorado, through Kansas. He was not fleeing in a panicked way. He was, by his own later account, waiting. He expected to be the subject of a massive manhunt. He expected the news to be dominated by his story. He expected the full weight of law enforcement to descend on him. When the weekend passed and there was no news story, no statewide alert, nothing, he pulled over at a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, and called the Santa Cruz Police Department. He confessed to everything. The detective who took the call, assuming a prank, initially hung up. Kemper called back. He gave his name, his location, and a comprehensive outline of what he had done. Then he waited for the police to arrive, sitting in a phone booth in Colorado, having killed 10 people, having spent a year being photographed with the officers who were supposed to catch him. The subsequent psychiatric evaluations of Ed Kemper produced material that is now required reading in forensic psychology programs across the world. His IQ of 145 placed him in the top 2% of the population. His self-analysis was so detailed and so clinically precise that several psychiatrists noted it exceeded the depth of analysis they would have produced themselves. He described his psychology with the vocabulary of the textbooks he had read during his time at Atascadero, using terms like ego dystonic and defense mechanisms and dissociative state with casual fluency. He knew, in other words, exactly what he was. He had known for years. The knowledge had not stopped him. The intelligence that made him so remarkable to the professionals who assessed him was not a counter to his violence, it was its instrument. He was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder in November of 1973. He requested the death penalty, which was not available at that time in California due to a moratorium on executions. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms. He has been incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville since 1973, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in California's prison system. Kemper has given extensive interviews over the decades, including his now famous conversations with FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler in the late 1970s, which contributed significantly to the development of criminal profiling as a discipline and were partially dramatized in the Netflix series Mindhunter. He has been denied parole multiple times and has reportedly, in recent years, stopped requesting it, saying that he does not think he should ever be released. Whether this is a genuine reflection of self-knowledge or another layer of performance is a question that the investigators who know him best have never been able to answer definitively. What remains, 50 years after his arrest, is the particular horror of a man who looked like an ordinary person, who worked alongside police officers, who sat at bar stools and drank beer and had normal conversations about sports and traffic, and who was, at the same time, engaged in acts of violence so extreme that even experienced investigators struggled to process the crime scene photographs. He was both of those things simultaneously, and the gap between them is not explicable by any simple narrative about monsters. Ed Kemper is not a monster in the sense of being something other than human. He is entirely, devastatingly human. That is the part of his story that is the hardest to sit with. That is the part that was always too brutal for Netflix. On the night of May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers pulled over a light-colored Toyota pickup truck that was weaving erratically on Interstate 5 near Mission Viejo. The driver was Randy Stephen Kraft, 38 years old, a computer consultant who lived in Long Beach. He was calm when the officers approached. He had been drinking. He was cooperative. He offered no resistance. He seemed, to the officers, like a slightly drunk man who had made a bad decision about driving. In the passenger seat, one of the officers noticed a figure sitting very still. Too still, Marine Lance Corporal Terry Gambrell, 25 years old, was dead. He had been drugged, sexually assaulted, strangled, and his body had been arranged in the passenger seat in what investigators would later describe as a posed position, as if Kraft had been driving for miles with a corpse seated beside him and had considered this normal enough to continue down the freeway. In the trunk of the Toyota, investigators found a locked briefcase. Inside the briefcase was a folded piece of paper. On the paper, written in a cramped, methodical hand, was a list of 61 cryptic entries, abbreviations, phrases, partial words that at first seemed like a random collection of codes. It was not random, it was a scorecard. Randy Kraft had been killing men for 12 years, and he had been keeping a record. The story of Randy Kraft begins in a way that defies every cultural expectation of what a serial killer's origin story is supposed to look like. He was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, into a stable, working-class family. His father was a factory worker. His mother was a homemaker. They were, by all accounts, ordinary, decent people who loved their son and by whom their son felt genuinely loved. There was no abuse, no neglect, no violence in the household, no alcoholism, no catastrophic loss. Randy Kraft grew up in a normal home, did well in school, graduated from Westminster High School, earned a scholarship to Claremont McKenna College, studied economics, was elected class president, graduated in 1967, served briefly in the Air Force. He was, by the time he left college, an intelligent, sociable, politically engaged young man who had begun to come to terms with his sexuality. He was gay. And while this was not something he had disclosed publicly in that era and in that social environment, it does not appear to have been a source of profound internal conflict in the way it was for many gay men of his generation. He was open, in private. He had relationships. He had friends who knew him well, and who, in the years after his arrest, would describe him consistently as warm, thoughtful, and kind, a man they had trusted completely. He began killing in 1971. His first confirmed victim was a 13-year-old boy named Wayne Duquette, found dead in the Ortega Highway area of Orange County, killed by a combination of drugs and strangulation. The case went unsolved. There was nothing to connect it to Randy Kraft, who was living a normal life in Long Beach, working, maintaining friendships, being a good neighbor. He had started something, and starting it had not produced the crisis, or the breakdown, or the collapse of ordinary function that one might expect. He continued to live his life. He killed again. Over the next 12 years, Randy Kraft killed at least 16 men in California, and possibly as many as 51 across California, Oregon, and Michigan. His confirmed victims were predominantly young men in their late teens and early 20s. Hitchhikers, military servicemen from the bases that dot Southern California, young men he picked up in bars. His method was consistent. He would offer a ride or meet them socially, drug them with alcohol spiked with sedatives or other substances, sexually assault them while they were incapacitated, kill them by strangulation or other means, and then dispose of their bodies along California's highway corridors. He was meticulous about removing or destroying evidence. He almost never left forensic material that could be connected to him. He drove tens of thousands of miles along the Southern California freeway system over more than a decade. And for more than a decade, he was invisible. The scorecard in his briefcase became the central evidence of the trial, and one of the most studied documents in the history of American serial killing. Investigators spent months decoding the 61 entries. Some were straightforward once the key was found, initials or partial names of victims. Some referred to physical characteristics. Some referred to locations. Some referred to acts. The code was not designed to be impenetrable. It was designed to be private, to be meaningful only to Kraft himself, a record he kept, not from necessity, but apparently from a compulsive need to document what he had done. Several criminal psychologists who reviewed the scorecard noted that its existence suggests a complex relationship between Kraft and his own violence, a need to make it real, to make it permanent, to have it witnessed, in some form, even if only by himself. The investigation that followed the briefcase discovery was vast and painstaking. The California Attorney General's office assembled a team of investigators who worked through Kraft's history, year by year, cross-referencing the scorecard entries against unsolved murders in California, Oregon, and Michigan. They interviewed hundreds of people. They exhumed remains. They tracked down servicemen from Camp Pendleton and the 29 Palms Marine Corps base who had known the victims. They built, slowly and with extraordinary effort, a case that linked Kraft to 16 confirmed murders and suggested his involvement in dozens more that could not, with the available evidence, be conclusively proven. What made the investigation so complicated was that Kraft looked and behaved in every context that was not the inside of his car, like a perfectly functional human being. He had held steady employment for years. He had maintained long-term friendships. He had been in a committed relationship with a man named Jeff Seelig for years, and Seelig had no idea, or so he maintained, in deeply shaken interviews after the arrest. He had hosted dinner parties. He had discussed politics. He had gone to work on Monday mornings after weekends, during which he had, investigators believe, committed murders. The double life was not sustained by charm or performance in the Gacy sense. It was sustained by compartmentalization, so total that the two lives apparently never touched. Randy Kraft, who made potato salad for his friends' barbecues, and Randy Kraft, who drove the freeways of Southern California looking for someone to kill, were apparently not in conversation with each other in any way that his friends or colleagues or partner could perceive. The trial began in September of 1988 and lasted nearly a year, making it one of the longest criminal trials in California history at that point. The prosecution presented over 30,000 pieces of evidence. Kraft represented himself for portions of the trial, a decision that allowed him to cross-examine witnesses directly, including the friends and former colleagues who testified against him, in a performance that many observers found deeply unsettling, precisely because he was so composed, so articulate, so seemingly in control. He never testified in his own defense. He never fully explained the scorecard. He maintained his innocence throughout, not with the theatrical defiance of Ramirez, but with the quiet, persistent dignity of a man who genuinely believed, or chose to project, that the proceedings were a mistake. He was convicted of 16 counts of first-degree murder on August 11, 1989, and sentenced to death on November 29 of the same year. He has been on death row at San Quentin State Prison ever since, making him one of the longest-serving death row inmates in California. He has pursued multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. He continues to maintain his innocence. The psychological portrait of Randy Kraft is one of the most debated in forensic criminology, precisely because his background so thoroughly dismantles the developmental models that are typically used to explain serial killing. He had no traumatic childhood. He had no obvious precursor events. The theories of attachment disruption and early violence exposure that explain so many other cases simply do not fit. What investigators and forensic psychologists have proposed instead is a picture of a man with profound antisocial personality traits operating beneath a surface of social competence so well maintained that it never broke down a man, who had somehow developed the capacity to treat certain human beings as objects available for his use, without this attitude contaminating his relationships with the human beings in the rest of his life. The mechanism by which this compartmentalization operates the cognitive architecture that makes it possible remains, in the literature, an open and deeply troubling question. The 51 names on the suspected victim list, the ones that could not be proven, the entries on the scorecard that investigators decoded but could not match to a specific, unresolved case, represent perhaps the most painful dimension of this story. For every confirmed victim, there may be 3 or 4 more, whose families never got an answer, never had a trial, never had the specific, terrible closure of knowing what happened to their son. Those names are entries on a coded list in a briefcase that a California Highway Patrol officer found on a freeway on-ramp in 1983. They deserve more than that. Randy Kraft is currently 79 years old, on death row at San Quentin. California has not carried out an execution since 2006 and has had a moratorium on capital punishment since 2019. Barring a dramatic change in state policy, it is likely that Randy Kraft will die in prison of natural causes, as Richard Ramirez did, before any execution is carried out. The families of his victims have been waiting for 40 years. They are still waiting. There are cases in the history of California crime that feel, in retrospect, like they should have been stopped sooner. Cases where the machinery of the justice system had its hands on the person responsible and then let go, and where what happened after the letting go is so catastrophic that the failure itself becomes part of the story, not as an excuse for what occurred, but as a necessary accounting for the full truth of how it occurred. William George Bonin is one of those cases. He was not a man who emerged from nowhere. He was a man who had been in the system, who had been convicted, who had served time for sexual assault against children, who had been identified by a California psychologist as a predator who presented an extreme danger to others if released, and who was released anyway. And what he did in the 14 months after that release is the story we are about to tell. William Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut, into circumstances that were, in the starkest possible way, the opposite of Randy Kraft's stable, loving household. His father was an alcoholic who gambled away the family's income. His mother was neglectful and frequently absent. There were 3 sons, and the family's dysfunction was so severe that all 3 boys were placed in a Catholic orphanage for a period during William's childhood. At the orphanage, Bonin was sexually abused by older residents. He was 8 years old. He was returned to his family, and the abuse continued. This time, from a grandfather who would be the first of several adults in Bonin's early life to treat him as available for their use. He was stealing from neighbors by the age of 10. He was in a juvenile detention facility by the age of 14 for fondling younger boys, behavior that mirrored what had been done to him with a directness that is textbook in the trauma literature and devastating in reality. He served in Vietnam as a door gunner on a helicopter, where, by several accounts including his own, he was involved in combat that was extraordinarily violent, even by the standards of Vietnam-era combat, and where he developed what one military psychiatrist later described as an almost complete desensitization to human suffering. He returned to California in 1969. In 1969 and 1971, he was convicted on multiple counts of sexually assaulting hitchhiking teenagers, male victims, young men he had picked up on the road and overpowered. He served time for these offenses. Before his 1975 parole hearing, a California Department of Corrections psychologist submitted a report that stated, in language that leaves no room for ambiguity, that Bonin was a sadistic sex offender who posed an extreme and ongoing threat to the public and should not be released. The parole board reviewed the report. They released him anyway. For 4 years, between 1975 and 1979, Bonin committed no murders that have been confirmed. What he was doing during those 4 years is not entirely known. He worked. He moved around Los Angeles. He almost certainly continued to assault people in ways that did not come to police attention. And he was building, somewhere in the architecture of his psychology, towards something that the violence of his past had been rehearsing. On August 4, 1979, a 14-year-old boy named Marcus Grabs was reported missing. His body was found near Malibu Creek. He had been picked up hitchhiking, sexually assaulted, and strangled with his own clothing. He was William Bonin's first confirmed murder victim. He would not be the last for 14 months. What followed was a campaign of murder that Los Angeles investigators would eventually recognize as one of the most prolific and violent in the city's history. Bonin operated along the freeway systems of Los Angeles and Orange County, primarily the Santa Ana Freeway, the Golden State Freeway, and the San Diego Freeway, picking up young men and teenage boys who were hitchhiking, runaways, or simply unlucky enough to accept a ride. He was charming in the specific way that predators who target vulnerable young men tend to be charming, non-threatening in appearance, conversational, apparently safe. He was not large or physically intimidating. He had a clean-shaven, ordinary face. There was nothing about him, at first encounter, that would have sent an alert signal to a teenager who needed a ride. Once in the van, and he drove a van? A detail that has become so associated with predatory behavior in the cultural imagination that it is easy to forget it was not always a red flag. Bonin would disable his victims through physical force, sometimes with the help of accomplices he recruited from among the young, damaged men who moved through his social orbit. He had 4 men who participated in at least some of his murders: Gregory Miley, James Monroe, William Ray Pugh, and Vernon Butts. The involvement of accomplices in serial murder is rare enough that the Bonin case is studied specifically for this element. The way Bonin was able to recruit young, volatile, impressionable men and make them complicit in acts of torture and murder is considered by forensic psychologists to be evidence of a sophisticated, if malignant, capacity for social manipulation. He killed 14 boys and young men between August 1979 and June 1980. Their ages ranged from 12 to 19. Most were hitchhikers. Most were either runaways or young men from unstable homes without strong family networks who would not be immediately missed. Bonin selected them not entirely at random. He had a type, a preference for young men who were vulnerable and disconnected, whose disappearances might be absorbed into the general noise of runaway statistics. He tortured most of them before killing them. He strangled them. He used objects. He took his time. The forensic detail of the murders is something that investigators who worked the case have described as among the most disturbing they encountered in entire careers spent processing violent crime scenes. The investigation was, in its early months, as frustrating as almost every major freeway murder investigation of that era. The bodies were being found along different sections of the freeway system, sometimes in different counties. Information was not being systematically shared between LAPD, the LA County Sheriff's Department, and the Orange County Sheriff. Investigators who had pieces of the puzzle were not always aware that other investigators had the adjacent pieces. The victims were predominantly from marginalized backgrounds, and some of the earliest missing person reports had been treated with less urgency than they deserved. The break came from inside Bonin's own circle. William Ray Pugh, one of the accomplices, had participated in 2 of the murders as a young man who was essentially manipulated and coerced into involvement, or so he later claimed. A characterization that prosecutors found partly, but not entirely, credible. Pugh spoke to investigators in June of 1980. He gave them Bonin's name, his van, his methods. Armed with this information, and with physical evidence that could now be properly contextualized, investigators moved quickly. William Bonin was arrested on June 11, 1980, while in the process of sexually assaulting a young man in his van in a parking lot in Linwood. The victim survived. The arrest was made. The van was seized and forensically examined and produced evidence that connected Bonin to multiple murders. The trial was bifurcated. Bonin was tried separately in Los Angeles County and Orange County for murders committed in each jurisdiction. In both trials, the evidence was overwhelming, and Bonin was, with occasional exceptions, not a difficult defendant in the conventional sense. He did not perform for the gallery in the way Ramirez did. He did not maintain an elaborate innocence narrative in the way Kraft did. He acknowledged what he had done in a general, flat way that investigators found neither remorseful nor particularly engaged, as if the murders were events that had happened to him rather than acts he had chosen. A framing that several forensic psychologists identified as indicative of an almost total absence of victim empathy, combined with a profound externalization of personal responsibility. He had been raised to feel that bad things happened to him. He had never fully developed the cognitive framework that would have allowed him to understand himself as the agent of bad things happening to others. He was convicted of 14 murders across the 2 trials and sentenced to death. His accomplices received varying sentences. Vernon Butts died in jail awaiting trial. Gregory Miley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. James Monroe was convicted and sentenced. William Pugh, who cooperated with investigators, received a reduced sentence of 15 years. The psychological analysis of William Bonin is, in many respects, more straightforward than the analysis of Kemper or Kraft, not because he is less disturbing, but because the developmental pathway is more legible. Childhood sexual abuse, institutional neglect, combat exposure, early sexual offending, failed intervention by the criminal justice system, escalation to murder. This is a pathway that appears in the literature repeatedly, that criminologists have documented across dozens of cases, and that the California prison system had every reason to recognize in William Bonin's file before they released him in 1975. The psychologist who wrote the report warning against his release was correct. The parole board that released him anyway made a decision that resulted in 14 deaths. This is not a comfortable thing to state plainly. It is nonetheless the truth. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison on February 23, 1996. He was the first person executed in California under a new protocol, replacing the gas chamber that had been ruled unconstitutional. He ate 2 pepperoni and sausage pizzas and 3 servings of ice cream as his final meal. He gave a brief final statement in which he told the families of his victims that he hoped his death would give them some relief. The families of his victims have described their feelings about that statement in various ways over the years. Several said it did give them something, though not exactly relief. Several said it meant nothing. One mother said, "I needed to hear him say my son's name." He didn't say any names. He said, "Your sons," as a group, like they were the same person. They were not the same person. Her son's name was David Murillo. He was 17 years old and he was hitchhiking on the Golden State Freeway because the bus had not come and he was tired, and a man in a van stopped and offered him a ride, and he said yes. David Murillo. And Thomas Lundgren, and Mark Shelton, and Marcus Grabs, and Donald Hayden, and Charles Miranda, and James McCabe, and John Fredrickson, and Stephen Wood, and Darren Kendrick, and Lawrence Sharp, and Harry Turner, and Russell Stouffer, and Glenn Barker. 14 names. 14 people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong man, in a state that had been told what he was and had let him go anyway. Their names deserve to be said out loud. They deserve more than a number in a case file. They are the reason this story matters. Not the man who killed them, not the psychology of the man who killed them, not the systemic failures that enabled him. The reason this story matters is that they were alive, and then they were not, and the distance between those two things is a man in a van on a California freeway and a 14-year-old boy who needed a ride home.